So I've got one of the post lead screws for the lifting mechanism, as well as the nut, and a new bearing. And these are, anybody that's curious, 6202. And I got sealed both sides, even though they were shielded both sides for the last one. I just usually swap those out for sealed. So I've got a block of wood that I drilled a hole in. I believe it was 3/8 of an inch. That fits just over the shaft on the end of the actual post itself, or the screw. So that'll fit there, which will allow me to drive the bearing on, which I will go ahead and start now. All right, so I've got a scrap underneath it too, just to kind of, I don't know, soften it a little, even though it's MDF top. I just figured a little bit of pine wouldn't hurt anything. All right, so now that that bearing is fully seated, we can drive it into here. But first, what you need to do is install the nut, just because once this is actually pushed in there, you won't be able to get that in there. So the other key factor on this is there's a curved side on one side and a flat spot on the other. And you need to make sure that the curved side is towards the bed of the planer. So in this case, that's up, since I have this thing upside down. All right, and once that's on there, I will go ahead and drive the top bearing in. All right, so for the first part of this, I'm going to use that same block because that fits over and that'll kind of push on both parts of it. So I'll do that first. All right, and that'll only get me flush with the top. And then in this case, I've got a 15/16 3/4 drive socket, and the 3/4 drive is not necessarily that important, but the important thing is this one's got a hole in it that goes all the way through that is large enough to fit over the shaft of this thing. And the 15/16 is big enough that it'll seat on the outside race of the bearing, leaving the rest of it alone. You might be able to get away with an inch depending on what the outside diameter of the socket is, but then the one that I had gets a little bit close to being a little too tight. Like, I didn't quite like the fit, because it's got to be able to fit in one of these posts here, so you can kind of see there's a little bit of wiggle room, but the 1 inch would have been tight, and I didn't want to run the risk of jamming this in there and having to get that out. So 15/16 it is, and then I can go ahead and drive this all the way in. And the reason you have to drive that all the way in is because then there is a clip that you have to install to keep all of that in there. All right. And I've already got one installed over here, one over here, so 2 more to go. I should also probably mention that I used the wax-based lubricant, the DuPont Chain Saver, on all of these post screws and corresponding nuts, just because it's wax-based and these are open, so there's some open slots that give access to these screws so that the nut can move up and down in them. And when I was taking them apart, there was quite a lot of sawdust packed in and around everything, just chips and stuff. So I decided to go that route, hoping that maybe that would help it not quite stick as much, rather than, you know, using an oil-based kind of lubricant in there, just to see if that would work. Nothing else, I figured I could always just clean them off and spray them down with either some, I like to use fluid film for a lot of stuff. I know it's not the greatest lubricant out there, but it gets the job done and it's anti-rust. So that's one of the things that I like about that. All right. All right, so this last one is just a little bit tricky. And the reason for that is because this is the one that the handle actually goes onto. So as you can see, it's got a little bit extra sticking out the top that'll need to be accommodated while you are driving it in. So if I block the bottom of it, you can see how far up that sticks. So that is why that one's a little bit different. That's awesome. All right, that is all 4 of those in place. And now I'm just kind of wiping everything on the bottom down with a little bit of fluid film just to kind of give it a little bit of rust prevention. All right, I've already installed 2 of them, but what I am working on now is the sprockets. I used a little bit of the fluid film on the shafts here, as well as coating the sprockets earlier. So these are all cleaned up, so those just slide on. There's a key there. And then I've got a washer and a nut. And just tighten those down. Screwdriver just to hold it. I don't need to go crazy tight on that or anything. I just want to get it tight enough, I guess. And same thing on this last one. Next up will be this. I've already done fluid film on all that. Just got to do the hardware a little bit. This is actually the chain tensioning. So I'm not going to put too much effort into getting that tightened on just yet. So I mean, I'll kind of tighten it down so it doesn't wiggle too much, but it still needs to be able to slide, because what'll end up happening is the chain will come through here. So this will have to move that way in order to tension the sprocket once I get everything put in place. And I know this isn't going to be the final time that I do this chain, because I know I'm going to have to set it once I get all 4 posts so that the elevator nuts are at the right height, because quite honestly I won't be able to do that until I have the top casting at least somewhat in place, because I have to get all these nuts lined up, and right now I know they are anything but. Once I'm done messing around with it, and I'll use some more of this chain saver and just get the whole chain all kind of lubed up and protected and ready to rock. Cool. Next thing up will be these lifting bars, and they just have little C-clips that go in here that'll lock those in place. Okay, so I've got the bottom casting flipped up here, and it should be more or less ready to go, and I intend to mount it onto the base. We'll see what happens here. You put the legs on the base already, assembled and put together and ready to rock. I am waiting on a mobile base, so we'll see if this ends up having to come off. I may end up putting it on there and then realizing I really can't move it with the added weight of the legs in the other base. See, I mean, I've put some pretty heavy machines on mobile bases by myself before, so we'll just see how that goes. So once you get this over here, one of the things you have to keep in mind is if you've already installed the chain kind of goes straight across here, across the planer, and then it kind of V's in and then back. And it's this V side, there's an open thing on the base here, and that's where that goes, because there's kind of a bit of the top casting with the gearbox may, have to slip down there depending on how deep you're planing. And the important thing that I found out is that when you're installing this, you have to make sure that the sprockets fit in those two notches, but also that you get the chain under that center. So and then you kind of slide beyond, and then you can drop this side in, and there's two notches on this side for the sprockets as well. And then you can bring it back and worry about lining it up and everything else. And actually, that's pretty good for not trying. And then there's just 4 bolts that kind of lock that all in place. And the big test, I can still lift it, barely. So hopefully I'll be able to get that on the mobile base once I get that in. And then I've got the top bushing for the elevation screw. Kind of just guides it, holds it in the middle. And yet another circlip here. And on that piece, it is important to note that there's, whoops, and I just screwed it up. So with this, once you get it installed, there's a little square that's been milled out of that bushing block that I don't see anything else that lines up with it. I'm assuming is for the little screw that holds the scale in place. So the depth of cut scale goes over here in a little recess, and there's a square notch in the outside of this bushing, and I just have it lined up where the screw goes to mount the scale. All right, so these are actually pretty simple, the bed rollers. There's basically just a tube with 2 bearings in the end of it, and then there's those little pins, and you put the bearings into the bed rollers, or in my case, one of them came with it, the other one didn't, and then you put those pins through the main casting, and then they just seat into the inner race of the bearings, and then you just kind of pound them in, and then there's 2 little set screws on the top of it that will hold them in place. Pretty simple, pretty easy. One of them was back ordered, so I'm still waiting on that one, but it does get here eventually, and I put it in.